All right, AP Stats. So, where we just wrapped up with was we just got done talking about chi-square tests for independence. Just as a review, we kind of talked about that they were essentially kind of the same thing as homogeneity, the big difference being in the idea of your hypotheses being um, association and no association instead of comparing two distributions. Um, we talked about all the conditions being the exact same. Um, and yeah, I mean, pretty much everything we did for that was very similar to homogeneity. Um, the difference being your hypotheses and your conclusion. Uh, so where we wrap things up in this unit is with this section called using chi-square tests wisely. Um, so to illustrate this section of the notes, which is going to focus on kind of identifying what would be the appropriate method to use when you're trying to decide between do I do a goodness of fit test versus do I do a test for homogeneity versus do I do a test for independence. So the example we're going to look at comes from an article in the Arizona Daily Star from April 9, 2009, which had the following table in it. It says, suppose that you were going to decide to analyze this data using a chi-square test. However, you didn't have any additional information about how the data was collected. Um, and with that being said, it's really not a it's really not possible to know which chi-square test is appropriate. So we'll kind of talk about what information we would need to know if each test would be appropriate based on this data. So notice that you've got kind of the age in years ranging from 18 to 24 all the way up to 65 and up versus do they use online social networks and or do they not use online social networks? So in part A, explain why it is okay to use age as a categorical variable rather than a quantitative variable. Because if you think about age, it would make sense to find an average age. So why in this case is it okay to use it as a categorical variable rather than quantitative? And the big idea here is that it's because it is separated into um, intervals or bins, however you want to kind of think about that. But intervals or bins is what makes it okay to use age as a categorical variable. In fact, really that's what you can do with any quantitative variable to make it into a categorical is to separate it into those bins or into those intervals. All right, so B, explain how you know that a goodness of fit test is not appropriate for analyzing this data. In other words, how do you know not to do goodness of fit? And the big thing there is that goodness of fit only works for one variable. So in this case, because you're looking at two variables, which are age versus do they use social networks or do they not use social networks, um, that's going to be what makes goodness of fit not an appropriate test. All right. So then C and D, let's compare kind of the difference between how would you know to use a test for homogeneity versus a test for independence. Um, so with homogeneity, let's first talk about that one. Describe how these data would be or could have been collected so that a test for homogeneity is appropriate. Um, and so in order for it to be appropriate for homogeneity, the data would have to come from separate or independent would be another way to think about that, random samples. In other words, if they were to collect data from 18 to 24-year-olds, and then collect data from 25 to 34-year-olds, and then collect data from 35 to 44-year-olds, and were to collect data from each age group separately, that's when a chi-square test for homogeneity would be appropriate. So you'd have these multiple independent random samples. Uh, so how that'll be different for a test for independence. So in D, describe how these data could have been collected so that a test for independence is appropriate. For that one, if the data came from a single random sample, that's when your test for independence is going to be the most appropriate. So the idea is that independence comes from a single random sample, homogeneity comes from separate independent random samples, um, both of which would be for two variables, whereas goodness of fit would be a single random variable. So I guess if you wanted to kind of think about a flow chart for this stuff, and this will be something again that we can kind of discuss more on Monday. So the first thing you have to think about is your data coming from a single random variable or is it coming from kind of two distinct random variables? And if it'll let me draw, I'll be able to show you that. Okay, let's see. It's not gonna let me draw. Let me try my best to do this here. So basically, you've got two different directions here that you can have. You can either have where you have one variable, or you can have where you have two variables. Um, and so right away, that helps you decide, are you going to do a chi-square test for goodness of fit, which would be a single random variable, or are you going to do a regular chi-square test, either for independence or homogeneity? So that's kind of the first distinction that you have to make there. The second distinction then would be for chi-squared test. Are you going to do this for homogeneity, or are you going to do it for independence? And the way you will decide between those two, homogeneity again needs to come from separate random samples. In other words, it needs to come from multiple samples. Whereas independence, you would need to have that coming from a single sample. In other words, all the data was collected at once, and you are just looking at it in terms of two different variables. So we'll talk more about the conditions for all of that, how they compare, and kind of what to do differently based on each of those tests on Monday. As far as the rest of this week goes, keep in mind there are two homework assignments posted on Schoology for you to work through, which are now your chi-square test for independence and using chi-square test wisely. In addition to those two assignments, the homework from Monday, which was chi-square test for homogeneity day number 2, is all going to be due on Monday. That will also be our review day, and tests will be next Wednesday. All right, guys, have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.